welcome to Steady Hall. This is But Why, Though? The segment where we really unpack the origins of, well, pretty much everything.
That's the idea.
And today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a relationship that I think many of us have encountered in some way. Maybe you are one, maybe you have one.
Mm-hmm.
It's a role that's often tied to a big life moment, right? But its meaning, well, it's twisted and expanded and adapted across centuries and cultures in some really surprising ways.
It really has.
So here's a question for you listening. Have you ever been a godparent? Or do you have one? What does that relationship actually mean to you? Is it, deeply religious for you?
Or maybe more about being the fun aunt or uncle who brings the good presents?
Exactly. Or is it something else entirely, like this unique thread in the fabric of your family, your community?
It seems so straightforward on the surface, doesn't it? You pick someone, they stand up with a kid at a ceremony. Maybe that's it. Maybe an annual birthday card, a confirmation gift, something like that.
Right. That might be the extent of it for some people.
But when you actually start digging into the history and you look at how it works, or has worked around the world, wow. You uncover this incredibly rich, complex, and honestly, often really unexpected institution.
Totally. And for this deep dive, we've gathered, well, a pretty fascinating stack of sources. We've got everything from the everyday kind of lived experiences that pop up in this really lively Reddit thread from Moresque Europe.
Yeah, that thread is gold, just full of personal stories, cultural quirks.
Exactly. And then we've got, the other end of the spectrum, dense academic research papers that meticulously comb through historical records like old parish registers.
Which gives you that hard data, that long-term view.
Right. And of course, religious texts that lay out the formal rules,
Yeah.
the theological meaning behind it all.
It's a powerful mix, actually, because you get the formal, the historical, the sort of official understanding,
Mm-hmm.
and then you get the messy, beautiful, incredibly varied reality of what being a godparent actually means to people day to day.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today is to take this really diverse set of sources and just pull out the most important nuggets, the most surprising facts about godparenthood.
Yeah, trace the journey.
We want to go from its earliest hints, its original purpose, right through its evolution, as this, social force, how it got regulated.
And what it looks like today across different faiths, different cultures.
Yeah. The goal is really to cut through all the info and leave you feeling genuinely well-informed on this topic that, might even be part of your own life story.
And while we're doing this, keep that first question kind of simmering in the back of your mind. What about your experience with godparents?
Right.
See if any of these historical roles or cultural practices or even some of the linguistic weirdness we find maybe clicks with your own background. Or maybe it completely surprises you, makes you see the whole thing in a new light.
Okay, so where do we even start? This whole idea of a godparent. Was there anything like it before Christianity came along?
That's a really fundamental question. And yeah, the sources definitely dig into that search for pre-Christian parallels.
And what did they find?
Well, the key takeaway seems to be that you don't find a perfect one-to-one match. There isn't an institution that was identical to the Christian godparent as it developed later.
Okay.
But you absolutely find cultural practices that kind of laid some groundwork or shared some underlying ideas. Things like having witnesses or maybe appointed guardians for kids, that pops up in various forms.
Like maybe in ancient Greece or Rome.
Precisely. You see glimpses of it in some Greco-Roman naming ceremonies or dedication rituals. Take the ancient Romans, for example. They had the dies lustricus.
Okay, what was that?
It was basically a naming ceremony, usually held 8 or 9 days after a child was born. It was a moment of formal purification, but also, crucially, naming the child and officially bringing them into the family.
So a big family ritual marking the kid's arrival.
Yeah, really significant. And the head of the household, usually the father, did this symbolic act called toller liberum, which literally means lifting the child.
Lifting the child.
Yeah, it was his formal way of acknowledging the child, accepting them into the family unit. Now, relatives and friends were often there, as witnesses to this important moment.
Mm-hmm.
But the sources emphasize there wasn't really a formally designated sponsor figure, not in the sense of someone taking on specific ongoing responsibilities beyond just being there to witness it.
Okay, so that ceremony, the dies lustricus, isn't quite the same thing then. But the sources do mention this Roman term susceptor. That sounds more relevant somehow.
Ah, the susceptor. Yes, that's a key term because
Yeah.
it carries over. The word itself just means one who receives.
One who receives.
In Roman custom, the susceptor was the person who would, like, physically pick up and care for the child during one of these ceremonies. And this role, interestingly, was often filled by the father himself or maybe a close relative who was essentially taking charge of the child's upbringing, their well-being.
And that term, susceptor, that's the one early Christians adopted. That feels like a really important connection.
It absolutely is. You have to remember, early Christians were living and practicing within this Roman cultural world, so they adopted the term susceptor for the sponsor, the person who would receive the newly baptized individual, whether it was an adult or later an infant as they came out of the baptismal font.
Wow.
And if you trace the Latin word sponder
Which means?
to promise, that's the root of our English word sponsor, it directly reflects the promise that this person was making.
So they're basically borrowing existing Roman concepts, Roman terminology, and then applying it to this completely new Christian context, the sacrament of baptism.
That's exactly right. I mean, the early church was innovative, sure, but it didn't operate in a vacuum. It adapted concepts from the culture around it. And that culture already understood the idea of someone vouching for another person, whether it was in legal stuff, business deals, or even the Roman patronage system, where a powerful patron supported and spoke for their client.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about the idea of creating bonds, like family bonds, but outside of blood relatives? Was that concept around before Christianity formalized godparenthood?
Yes, definitely. The sources talk about the existence of fictive kinship or ritual kinship in various pre-Christian societies.
Fictive kinship.
Yeah, the idea was basically establishing bonds that were treated as if they were biological kinship, but created through specific ceremonies or rituals. Think about things like formalized blood brotherhood pacts or alliances that were sealed through some kind of ritual act. These were ways to extend your social network, your support system, beyond just your immediate blood family.
Okay, so that idea of creating family outside of blood ties was definitely present. But the crucial difference here is,
The sources are pretty clear on this. These pre-Christian fictive kinship practices weren't specifically tied to infant initiation or a religious rite, quite like Christian baptism. That specific link creating spiritual kinship through a religious initiation sacrament that seems to be the unique innovation of Christianity.
what about Jewish tradition? Since it's so foundational for early Christianity, is there anything like a godparent role there?
That's a good question. In classical Judaism, you won't find a permanent, ongoing godparent role that really mirrors the Christian model as it evolved. However, the sources do mention the Brit Milah,
The circumcision ceremony for boys.
right, performed on the 8th day. And within that ceremony, there are definitely highly honored roles. There's the mohel, of course, who performs the circumcision. And there's the sandek, that's the person, often a respected elder or relative, who has the really important role of holding the baby during the procedure. And sometimes there's a married couple called the kavater who carry the baby into the ceremony.
So honored roles, but not quite godparents.
They're deeply respected positions within that specific ritual, absolutely, but they don't typically involve that kind of permanent responsibility for the child's religious upbringing or acting as formal spiritual parents in the way that Christian godparenthood came to be understood.
Okay, so it really sounds like Christianity took some existing cultural ingredients, the idea of sponsors, witnesses, maybe creating ritual kinship, and then synthesized them into something new, something designed to meet its own specific needs at the time.
That's precisely what the sources highlight, yeah. The Christian godparent role developed as a direct response to the specific theological and social demands of the early church.
And what were those demands exactly? Why did they need this role?
Well, in the early church, you have to remember most converts were adults, and for them, godparents were absolutely critical.
Why critical?
They were needed to basically verify the sincerity of the convert's faith. I mean, converting to Christianity back then wasn't just a casual choice. It could come with serious risks, persecution even.
Right.
So you needed someone to stand up for you, to essentially say, look, I can vouch for this person. Their commitment to the faith is genuine.
Kind of like a spiritual character reference, but maybe more intense.
More than that, really. Early church leaders, prominent theologians, bishops, they spoke about godparents with immense reverence. They often called them spiritual fathers and mothers,
Why?
and even spiritual co-parents.
Spiritual co-parents.
Yep.
Just that term alone tells you how incredibly important they saw this relationship.
It really does. And their primary job, initially, was to help with catechesis, basically teaching the convert the core beliefs and practices of Christianity.
Okay.
And then, crucially, to provide ongoing support and guidance for their lifelong spiritual formation.
So they weren't just there for the baptism ceremony itself. They were signing up for like a lifetime of spiritual guidance for this person.
That was the ideal, yes.
Yeah.
Now, things started to shift as Christianity grew, and infant baptism became more and more common. This was happening particularly by late antiquity.
Right, because an infant can't exactly profess faith or have their sincerity verified in the same way.
Exactly. So the role had to adapt. Instead of vouching for an adult's conversion, the godparent came to represent the faith community at the baptismal rite.
How so?
They would speak on behalf of the child, making the promises, the renunciations of evil. And they pledged to help the parents raise the child in the Christian faith. The sponsor still remained that distinct spiritual parent figure, often deliberately kept separate from the natural parents.
Why was it important to keep that separation from the biological parents?
Well, the distinction served a theological purpose, really. It symbolized that the child wasn't just entering their biological family, but also this broader spiritual family, the church community itself. The godparent was kind of the representative of that larger community, welcoming and supporting the child.
And by this point, was having a godparent mandatory? Was it required for baptism?
Yes, by this stage it became pretty standard. At least one godparent became a requirement for baptism, whether it was for an infant getting baptized or an adult catechumen joining the church. This really solidified their integral role in the sacrament itself.
Okay, so we've traced this evolution from these hints in pre-Christian customs through the really critical need for sponsors in early adult conversion. Then the shift to representing the community in infant baptism, establishing this distinct spiritual parent role. What happens next as the church and society continue to evolve, like into the Middle Ages?
The medieval period. This is where the church really takes this established role and builds it into a massive foundational social institution. Godparenthood becomes absolutely central, not just to religious life, but really to the whole social structure of the time.
Central how?
These relationships became formally codified in canon law, the church's legal system, and they were deeply ingrained in popular customs, celebrations, just the way society worked across Europe.
So it went way beyond just the religious aspect.
Oh, significantly. The sources really highlight the dual nature of the godparent bond during this period. On the one hand, it was definitely spiritual kinship, right? A sacred relationship forged in the sacrament of baptism. But on the other hand, it was also a major source of social capital. Choosing a godparent became a way for families to extend their social ties beyond their blood relatives. It could create connections with families from different social classes or maybe different towns or regions.
So like a way to build alliances or expand your network.
Exactly. The sources talk about strengthening existing friendships, but they also note that in this European context, the word amicitia, friendship, often meant something much more formal and binding than just being pals.
Ooh.
Yeah, it often implied relationships of close interdependency, mutual support, sometimes even political alliance. So choosing your godparents could be a very strategic move to solidify really important bonds.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. So this role, which started as primarily spiritual, got tangled up with social maneuvering, building power networks.
Absolutely. And this expansion, this intertwining with social and even political life, eventually led to increasing attempts to, regulate the whole institution.
Regulation by who? The church authorities,
Yeah.
secular rulers.
Both, actually. The Council of Trent, the major Catholic Reform Council in the mid-16th century, responding partly to the Protestant Reformation, they addressed godparents explicitly.
Okay.
But lay authorities, like city governments or local lords, were also very keen to exert some control over it.
What were they trying to control? What was the problem?
Well, they wanted to curb what they saw as non-sacred elements that had kind of glommed onto the baptismal ritual over time. This included trying to regulate the excessive baptismal pomp that had become common.
Pomp. Like what, big parties?
Yeah, things like really elaborate banquets, maybe extravagant gifts being exchanged, that sort of thing.
Why do they care about parties and presents? Seems a bit killjoy.
Well, the motivations kind of differed. Lay authorities like city councils were often worried about pauperization.
Pauperization.
Yeah, basically people spending ruinous amounts of money on these baptism celebrations, maybe to show off or just meet intense social expectations. They saw it as a potential drain on the community's resources.
Oh, okay. An economic concern.
Right. The church, on the other hand, was primarily concerned with preserving baptism as a purely sacred rite, an entrance into the Christian community. They wanted to strip away what they considered profane traits or excessive worldliness that had kind of crept into the ceremony and its associated festivities.
So one was worried about the economy, the other about spiritual purity. Got it.
Broadly speaking, yeah. And one significant change that came out of the Council of Trent, partly aimed at reducing some of this excess and maybe limiting the scope for all that alliance building, was a reduction in the number of godparents officially allowed. It was often limited to just one godfather and one godmother.
Just two. That seems pretty modest compared to how many godparents some people have in certain traditions, even today.
It was definitely a move towards simplification and standardization in many Catholic areas, however. The sources do note that despite these official attempts at regulation, older customs and regional variations often persisted, especially in areas where the Reformation had taken hold and was challenging the Catholic Church's authority anyway.
Okay, speaking of canon law and regulation, you mentioned earlier that this spiritual kinship had implications beyond just the religious sphere. How did it affect something as basic as marriage?
Ah, yes. This is a truly significant and maybe surprising consequence of how godparenthood developed in the medieval period. Spiritual kinship, the bond created through sponsoring someone's baptism, was deemed by church law, by canon law, to be akin to biological kinship, like being related by blood.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Akin to blood kinship?
Yes. And this had very real legal implications, particularly when it came to who you could marry.
Marriage. You
Yep.
mean like you couldn't marry someone just because you were their godparent?
Exactly. Canon law prohibited marriage between the godparent and their godchild. That's maybe the most obvious one, but it actually went even further than that.
How so?
In some interpretations and during certain periods, it could also prohibit marriage between the godparents themselves.
So the godfather and godmother couldn't marry each other?
Right, or even between the godparents and the natural parents of the child they sponsored.
Hold on. So if I was your child's godfather, you and I couldn't get married, even if, say, we were both widowed later on. That seems like a huge constraint on people's lives.
It absolutely was. It created these incredibly complex networks of prohibited relationships, all based on these spiritual ties created at baptism. And this whole system of extensive canonical prohibitions on marriage, based on spiritual kinship, became a major point of contention during the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, I can see why. Who specifically took issue with this?
Martin Luther was a very vocal critic. He basically argued that these rules were unwarranted expansions by the church that had absolutely no basis in Scripture.
So he thought the church just made them up.
He believed the church had overstepped its authority, essentially using these spiritual relationships to create legal barriers to marriage that weren't justified by the Bible.
And did his view win out in the Protestant churches that followed his lead?
Generally, yes. The sources indicate that Lutheran churches, and many other Protestant traditions, largely followed Luther's perspective on this. They abolished those marriage taboos that were derived solely from spiritual kinship. This marked a really clear divergence from Catholic practice at the time.
Okay, wow. So we've gone from ancient hints and early religious necessity through this powerful social institution tangled up with alliances, regulations, even impacting who you could marry. Let's fast forward now. Bring it closer to the present day, and look at how this actually plays out in different cultures. This is where that Reddit thread comes in handy, right? Giving us a snapshot of real lived experience.
It really does. And what that Reddit thread from Rask Europe shows so clearly is just how incredibly varied the role of a godparent is in the modern world. Even within cultures that share a common historical link to Christianity, the understanding and practice can be wildly different. It's a true melting pot of personal stories and expectations.
Let's dig into some of those specifics people shared. What were some of the big differences that jumped out?
Well, just the perceived importance of the role vary hugely. For example, someone from Ukraine mentioned the special word, u, or kum.
Cool.
Yeah, and it's used specifically between the parents and the godparents, and also between the fellow godparents themselves. It signifies this recognized, almost familial bond. Then you have another user from Serbia quoting this really powerful saying, Bog na nebu, cum na zemlju,
which means
God in heaven's Godfather on earth, which just shows the extremely high regard, the importance placed on the Godfather role in some parts of Serbia.
God in heavens, Godfather on earth. Wow, that elevates the Godfather to an incredibly significant position in the child's life. That's intense.
It really emphasizes that importance, yeah. But then you get completely contrasting experiences, sometimes even within the same country, like Italy. One user mentioned being baptized, but having literally never met their godparents, didn't even know if they were still alive.
Really? Never met them.
Never met them. Yet other users, particularly from southern Italy, describe having pretty solid relationships with their godparents, feeling it's an honor to be asked to take on the role. So, huge variation.
So it's not just country to country, but maybe region within a country, or even just down to individual family choice and dynamics.
Absolutely. The personal connection, or lack thereof, seems to be a massive factor. Another really common theme that emerged was who people typically choose.
Right.
The thread shows this really strong tendency in many places towards choosing family members. Aunts and uncles came up constantly as the sort of default choice in places like Spain, Slovenia, France, Germany, Ukraine.
Interesting.
One user from Spain even said it would feel strange if you didn't ask your siblings to be godparents, assuming you have siblings you're close to.
That's such a fascinating shift, isn't it? If you think back to the medieval or early modern periods where it was sometimes used to build new connections outside the family.
Exactly.
Now, in many places, primarily used to reinforce connections within the existing extended family.
It's a really clear trend reflected in these modern experiences, and you get these wonderful, complex examples that just blur all the lines. Like, there was one user who mentioned being an atheist, but acting as godfather for his cousin's daughter.
An atheist godfather. Oh.
Yeah. And get this. The child's godmother was his own mother, so the child's great aunt. It created this layered connection of spiritual, in name anyway, biological, and chosen family ties, completely outside the traditional religious framework for him.
That really underscores how the social and familial aspects of the role can persist, even when the religious element isn't there for the individual involved. What about how often people actually interact? Is it usually a close relationship in practice?
Again, that varies as much as everything else. Some people reported very infrequent contact, maybe seeing their godparents only for major life events like First Communion or confirmation, if that. Others see their godparents really regularly, especially if they're nearby family members, aunts, or uncles they see all the time anyway. One user mentioned their godparent lives in Australia, so they only see her when she visits every few years. It just highlights the practical challenges of maintaining that relationship across distance.
And the expectations. Let's talk about gifts. Is the godparent equals presence thing real?
Oh, yes. Gifts were a very prominent theme in the responses. Users, especially from places like Poland, Germany, and Slovenia, mentioned that godparents are often expected to give the most significant or expensive presents, particularly for the baptism itself, but also birthdays, Christmas, things like that. One user even joked about the financial burden if you end up having multiple godchildren.
Uh-huh. So that ancient concern from the Council of Trent about baptismal pomp and spending, maybe it's just morphed into a modern concern about the cost of godparenting.
There's certainly that angle. And you see charming traditions tied to it, too, like the Ukrainian custom where godchildren specifically visit their godparents on Christmas to receive sweets. That's a nice, specific gift-giving connection.
That is sweet.
However, there was also a noticeable thread of sentiment from some users, feeling that maybe the role has become less meaningful, less important over the last 20 years or so, that it's been reduced primarily to just being the designated gift giver.
So a feeling that for some, the deeper supportive or religious role might be getting lost or de-emphasized now.
Yeah.
What about that historical idea of godparents as potential caregivers if something happened to the parents? Did that come up?
It did. Both the historical sources and the Reddit thread mention this origin, the idea that godparents might step in to raise the child if the parents died. Users in places like Slovenia and Germany acknowledge this as a known historical tradition.
But is it still expected today?
They generally emphasize that today it's more of a historical echo than a formal legal expectation. Legal guardianship is usually handled separately through wills and legal arrangements. Although families might certainly choose their godparents with that potential role in mind, hoping they'd be willing and able, and then make sure it's legally documented.
Right, makes sense. The language around godparenthood also seems to vary quite a bit across Europe.
It does, yeah. We saw terms like kum in several Slavic languages, krstni for godfather and krzesna for godmother in Polish. The Dutch use pietum and pietante.
Pietum and pietante, what do those mean?
They literally translate to sponsor uncle and sponsor aunt.
Sponsor uncle and sponsor aunt. That's incredibly descriptive. Really spells out the relationship.
It really does. And there was some delightful confusion, actually, in the thread among German speakers about the correct terms. Yeah, some users were debating whether the proper terms are Gottvater and Gottmutter or Patenonkel and Patentante. Several German users insisted they literally never heard Gottvater or Gottmutter used for godparents. They only associated those terms with God the Father and the Virgin Mary, respectively.
Okay, let's break that down. Godvater is literally Godfather. Gottsmutter is God's mother, usually referring to Mary. Patenonkel and patentante mean sponsor uncle and sponsor aunt. So it's the difference between potentially calling your godparent something that sounds almost divine,
Right.
versus something that clearly frames them within a family relationship, like an uncle or aunt.
Better.
That's a pretty significant linguistic distinction, and yeah, I can see the potential for confusion.
It absolutely is, and it just highlights how language evolves and how meanings can shift, sometimes leading to a disconnect with the original sense. And speaking of linguistic oddities, remember that Polish meaning of kum?
Right.
Yeah.
In Ukraine, it's this term of kinship between the parents and godparents.
Yeah.
But in Poland,
Apparently, kum can also mean something like a close partner in a shady business, and it's linked to the word kumatos too, which means nepotism or cronyism.
wait, seriously, so the exact same word root can mean a respected fellow parent in spirit in one place,
Yeah.
and basically a partner in crime or symbol of nepotism just across the border. How on earth did that happen?
You know, the sources we looked at don't give us the full etymological journey for that specific divergence, unfortunately. But it's a truly striking example, isn't it? How the same word can take on wildly different, even contradictory connotations depending on the specific cultural and historical context it's used in. Just shows language is alive, constantly
It
shifting.
really does. That's wild. And the thread also touched on the idea of non-religious godparents or secular ceremonies, right?
Yes, that definitely came up. Users in Germany, for example, mentioned people having godparents who aren't Christian at all, viewing the role simply as a non-religious way to designate important supportive adults, like a special aunt or uncle. And this connects directly to the concept of civil baptism or secular naming ceremonies, which actually have a history going back quite a way, things like during the French Revolution, even if they aren't always formally recognized everywhere today. It points towards that desire for secular alternatives, which we can definitely talk more about later.
Okay, so the modern picture is just incredibly diverse. From deeply religious roles to purely social ones, close family to distant gift givers, plus all these linguistic quirks. To really understand how these variations developed, especially that shift towards familiarization we saw hints of, and also the political angle, let's dive into those specific historical case studies the academic sources provide.
Excellent idea. Let's start with that 19th century Bohemian rural community, based on the detailed study from Cairn that analyzed the parish registers from Novi Richnov. That was between 1800 and 1899.
Right.
And they looked at records for nearly 7,000 baptisms, which is just a fantastic data set to work with.
7,000 baptisms. That's an incredible amount of information. What did those old records reveal about godparenthood in that specific time and place? What were the big trends?
Well, one of the most significant findings, maybe the most significant, was this clear and consistent trend that the researchers labeled familiarization.
Familiarization, meaning?
Getting a constantly increasing number of children whose godparents were members of their own extended family, blood relatives.
Wow. So over the course of the 19th century, people in this area were increasingly picking godparents they were already biologically related to.
Exactly. The study noted a particularly sharp increase in this during the second quarter of the century, roughly 1825 to 1850, where the proportion of blood-related godparents almost doubled. It points to this really strong tendency throughout the century to kind of reduce the circle of spiritually related people, pulling the godparent role much closer into the existing family network, rather than using it to reach outside the family.
That's a fundamental shift, isn't it? Moving from godparenthood as a potential tool for building new social connections, maybe across class lines or villages,
Right, yeah.
to becoming primarily a tool for reinforcing the connections you already had within your own kin group. That really changes the institution's social purpose in this region.
It absolutely does, and the data backed this up further. They found that siblings within the same family often had the same godparents. It became less common for each child to have a completely different set.
Oh, okay.
And even if the godparents did vary between siblings, it was usually within a pretty limited, predictable pool of people, suggesting families were really sticking within their established network when making these choices.
Were there any patterns in which relatives were typically chosen, like mother's side versus father's side?
Yes, the study did find some patterns there. Apparently, biologically related godfathers often predominated. And interestingly, relatives from the mother's side of the family became increasingly significant choices as the century wore on. Now, identifying exact relationships purely from old registers can be tricky, especially with common surnames causing confusion.
Sure, homonyms and all that.
Right. But the overall trend was unmistakable. Blood ties were becoming absolutely paramount in selecting godparents in this community.
What about married couples serving as godparents together? Was that common?
The study found that was quite frequent, yeah. And this is where it gets really fascinating in terms of how different types of relationships could layer onto each other.
How so?
Often, one member of the godparent couple would be biologically related to the child. Maybe the godfather was the child's mother's brother, for instance. His wife, who would be the godmother, would then be related to the child by affinity, meaning related through marriage to a blood relative.
Okay, so one was blood relation, the other was tied in through their marriage to the blood relation.
Exactly. And the study points out how this common scenario created three distinct types of connections simultaneously between the child and that godparent couple. You had biological kinship through one partner, you had affinity through the other partner's marriage, and you had spiritual kinship created through the baptismal ritual itself. It shows how these different forms of relatedness could overlap and really reinforce each other within the family structure.
The study also mentioned something about godparents for illegitimate children in this region. Was that a different situation?
It was, and the details are quite revealing about the social pressures of the time. The study found that blood-related godparents were particularly important for the socialization of illegitimate children. Often, it was relatives of the unmarried mother who stepped up to accept the role of godparent.
What does that suggest? Why relatives specifically?
Well, the study proposes that this might have been a way to kind of contain or limit the potential embarrassment or social stigma associated with illegitimacy. Having relatives accept the role might have prevented awkward situations where non-relatives felt uncomfortable or maybe even offended, as the study puts it, by being asked to be a godparent to a child born out of wedlock and therefore refused. It kept it in the family, so to speak.
That paints a pretty stark picture of the social judgment involved back then.
It really does. And related to this, the study also noted a significant increase over the century in baptisms for illegitimate children being performed not by the priest in the full ceremony, but by midwives or church sacristans.
Midwives or sacristans acting as godparents too.
Yes. By the last quarter of the 19th century, almost half of the baptisms for illegitimate children in this parish had a midwife or sacristan listed as the godparent.
Wow. Was it clear from the records why this was happening? Was it definitely because of the illegitimacy, or could it have been other factors?
The study raises that exact question. Was this shift indicating a kind of reserved attitude, maybe some discomfort with the full public ritual because of the child's illegitimacy? Or was it perhaps more reflective of the difficult social status and often extreme poverty faced by unmarried mothers, making it simply harder for them to secure proper godparents from outside their immediate circle, or relying on professional helpers like midwives? The data doesn't give a single definitive answer, but it certainly highlights the complex challenges these mothers faced.
So this Bohemian case study really vividly illustrates how godparenthood, in practice, adapted to serve the evolving social needs of that specific time and place.
It absolutely does. The study concludes that in this particular rural context, baptism gradually took on a new, relatively significant aspect of a family celebration. It effectively became a tool to strengthen family ties.
Which is such a powerful contrast to those earlier periods we discussed, where it was often used precisely to establish social connections outside the family or to link families with powerful patrons or allies.
Exactly. A complete inversion, in some ways, of its earlier social function.
It's just fascinating to see that kind of shift documented with real historical data over a century. Okay, now let's pivot completely. From 19th century rural Bohemia, let's go to early modern Venice.
Ah, Venice. Yes, based on that semantic scholar study, this gives us a really compelling and very different look at how godparenthood could become explicitly tangled up with the world of high-stakes politics.
Politics. How on earth did a religious rite like baptism get pulled into political power plays in Venice?
Well, the study argues that by the 16th century, baptism, especially among the powerful Venetian patrician class, the nobility essentially became a political question. Why? Because the lay authorities, meaning the ruling elite themselves, took such a direct interest in it.
And why were they so interested? What was in it for them?
According to the source, the Venetian nobility quite deliberately exploited spiritual kinship as a core strategy to achieve their political and electoral aims. It was a key mechanism for creating or consolidating interfamily ties within and between the powerful families that ran the republic.
So they were literally using godparented appointments to build and reinforce political alliances among themselves, like horse trading favors.
Precisely. It was apparently so ingrained in their political strategy that it actually prompted direct intervention from one of Venice's most powerful and secretive governing bodies, the Council of Ten.
The Council of Ten, the ones known for like political intrigue and enforcement. What do they do about godparents?
They actually issued specific bans targeting certain godparenting practices among the nobility. For instance, they forbade noblemen from inviting certain individuals of lower status, like prominent community members from cities or territories ruled by Venice, to serve as godparents for their children.
Why would they stop that? What was the threat?
The council saw these invitations as a way for the Venetian nobles to essentially secure the political loyalty or future support of these lower status individuals, who were often seen as acting as proxies for their husbands or other influential male relatives back home. The ban was even extended at times to noble women acting as godmothers for the children of other patrician families.
So they were actively trying to prevent godparenthood from being used to build potentially destabilizing alliances or power blocks, even within the noble class itself. Is that the idea?
That's the interpretation the source presents. Now, the stated justification for these bans often reference those old canonical rules we talked about, the ones saying spiritual kinship prevented marriage.
Ah, the convenient excuse.
Right. But the study strongly suggests the likely real motivation for the Council of Ten was much more pragmatic, much more political. Ensuring the loyalty of godparents remained directed towards the Republic itself, and preventing this powerful spiritual bond from being leveraged for inappropriate political advantage or faction building that could threaten the stability of the state.
So the religious rule becomes a useful cover for exerting political control. That's pretty cynical.
Yeah.
Do we have specific examples of how this political godparenting actually played out on the ground in Venice?
Yes, the study provides some absolutely fascinating examples, drawn partly from the detailed diaries of Marin Sanudo, who was a prominent Venetian diarist and politician himself back in the late 15th and early 16th centuries.
What did Sanudo record?
He recorded multiple instances where he was invited to be a godparent, specifically by fellow politicians who held the same government office as him at the time. And, very tellingly, the co-godparents chosen for these same baptisms often included key bureaucrats, notaries, and other officials employed by the Venetian Republic.
So they are using godparenting choices to literally solidify working relationships and political connections within the government structure itself.
Exactly. It was a way to layer the powerful bond of spiritual kinship onto existing professional and political relationships, reinforcing loyalty, cooperation, maybe even obligation.
Clever. Any other examples?
Another really compelling case mentioned is that of a patrician named Francesco Valier. When choosing godparents for his children, he apparently selected a remarkably heterogeneous group, as the study calls it. His selections cut vertically right through Venetian society.
How so? Who did he pick?
It included members of the ducal chancellery, top administrators, respected doctors and lawyers, prominent merchants, but also, get this, a flute player, alongside various nobles from cities that were subject to Venetian rule.
A flute player. That's definitely not who I would first expect to see on a list, alongside government officials and wealthy merchants as a politically strategic godparent choice. What does that incredible mix tell us?
It powerfully demonstrates that godparenthood in Venice wasn't just about forging alliances horizontally within the ruling class or strictly between social equals. It was also used strategically to bring talented individuals, useful professionals, potentially influential figures from different social strata into the family's orbit, into their network of spiritual connection. It was about building a really broad base of support and influence across society.
Okay, but did the Council of Ten's bans actually stop these kinds of practices. Did they work?
Well, the sources indicate that while the bans certainly existed on paper, the sheer strength of tradition, combined with the clear strategic value of using godparenthood this way, meant that many of these practices persisted, perhaps just more discreetly. For instance, Venetian governors serving in territories outside Venice itself still continued to choose godparents for local children.
Right.
Although a later law in 1644 did try to tighten things up again, it restricted those governors' choices, saying they could only pick fellow Venetian nobles or other Republic employees who were present locally. It explicitly excluded them from choosing members of the local community or representatives of the subject populations as godparents anymore.
Wow. So even appointing a godparent in some faraway territory was being viewed through this lens of maintaining control, ensuring loyalty back to the Republic in Venice.
That's definitely the takeaway from the Venetian case study. It's just a remarkable illustration of how godparenthood, which we might think of as a purely religious or maybe family-oriented thing, could be adapted and leveraged as this really sophisticated tool for political maneuvering, for cementing networks within the unique, complex power structure of the Republic of Venice. It's a world away from the original spiritual role or even the family-focused role we saw developing in 19th century rural Bohemia.
It's truly mind-boggling how the exact same core institution could end up serving such vastly different functions depending on the specific historical moment and the social context it's embedded in.
It really, really highlights the flexibility, the adaptability of this seemingly simple idea over time.
Okay, so we've looked at the deep historical roots. We've seen these incredible contrasting case studies from Bohemia and Venice. Let's bring it back closer to the present now and look more systematically at how different Christian denominations approach godparenthood today. And then we can explore those non-Christian parallels and the rise of secular alternatives we hinted at.
Sounds good. Yeah, the Protestant Reformation, as we've touched on, definitely brought about a significant reevaluation of the godparent role across the board. While the major reformers like Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin ultimately retained the practice of infant baptism, unlike some of the more radical reformers, their specific views and the emphasis they placed on sponsors did vary.
Okay, remind us who the radical reformers were in this context, the ones who didn't keep infant baptism.
Right, so these were groups like the Anabaptists and later traditions that grew out of that stream, like the Baptists. A really core belief for them was and is believers' baptism, meaning that baptism should only be performed for adults, or at least individuals old enough to make a conscious, personal confession of faith before being baptized. Because they rejected infant baptism, the traditional concept of godparents specifically for infants just didn't really exist or make sense in their practices.
That makes perfect sense. If there's no infant baptism, there's no need for an infant godparent in that specific role.
Exactly. Now, these traditions might well have adult sponsors for adult converts who are being baptized. Or they might practice things like baby dedication ceremonies, where the congregation, the whole community, pledges to support the parents in raising the child in the faith. But that's done without the sacramental water baptism for the infant, and without the formal designation of godparents in that traditional quasi-parental sense.
So they found other ways to express that community support for the child's faith upbringing.
Okay, what about the major reformers who did keep infant baptism, like Luther?
Right, they generally retained the use of sponsors, but often with different interpretations and emphases compared to the Catholic Church at the time. Martin Luther, as we discussed, upheld infant baptism and definitely recognized the value of sponsors or godparents. In fact, he served as a godfather himself many, many times, which just shows how deeply embedded the custom was in society.
And we know he was vehemently against those complicated spiritual kinship marriage rules the Catholic Church had developed. Precisely. He saw them as completely arbitrary, unbiblical additions. And Lutheran churches generally followed his lead on that, abolishing those specific marriage prohibitions that were derived solely from spiritual kinship.
Did Luther redefine the godparents' actual role or duties in any significant way?
Yes, he placed a particularly strong emphasis on the godparents' educational responsibility. Alongside the parents, he really expected godparents to take an active role in ensuring the child was taught the basic tenets of the Christian faith. The Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, and more broadly, that they were raised to understand and live as a Christian.
Okay.
This focus on active participation in religious education remains pretty important in Lutheran practice today. Godparents are seen as crucial aides in the child's Christian upbringing, and they're typically expected to be baptized believers themselves, usually active within the Christian faith. Some Lutheran churches might even allow a non-Lutheran Christian to stand as a formal witness alongside a confirmed Lutheran godparent.
Interesting. So a strong focus on teaching the faith. What about other major reformers like Zwingli in Zurich or Calvin in Geneva?
Zwingli, in Zurich, he allowed for sponsors, but his theology placed a greater emphasis on the primary roles of the parents and the broader believing community in raising the child in faith, perhaps slightly downplaying the unique role of the individual sponsor compared to Luther. Calvin, in Geneva, seems to have been somewhat more ambivalent about the absolute necessity of sponsors. Sources suggest he sometimes favored the idea of just the parents acting in that capacity, or perhaps only having a single sponsor rather than a pair.
And the Anglican tradition, the Church of England.
Yeah, the Church of England retained the use of sponsors through its own Reformation process. And intriguingly, even despite that period during the English Commonwealth in the mid-17th century when the Puritan-dominated government actually tried to abolish the practice entirely.
They tried to ban godparents.
They did. But the custom proved incredibly resilient. It basically outlasted the ban and came back strongly afterwards, which really suggests just how deeply embedded its cultural roots were in England, beyond just the official church doctrine.
Wow. So even within mainline Protestantism, there's quite a range of views and historical experiences, often tied to specific theological points or the circumstances of their own reformations. Okay, let's turn to the Catholic Church today. How is the role defined and practiced now?
Well, in the Roman Catholic Church, the godparent role remains formally upheld. It's still considered a requirement, whenever possible, for a valid baptism. You need at least one official godparent.
And what are the specific requirements? Who can be a Catholic godparent according to current canon law?
The Church has pretty clear criteria laid out. A godparent must be a Catholic who has themselves been baptized, received confirmation, and usually received the Eucharist, First Communion. They generally need to be at least 16 years old. And crucially, they must lead a life of faith in keeping with the function to be taken on, basically. Be an actively practicing Catholic whose life is consistent with the responsibilities they're undertaking.
So not just Catholic in name, but actively practicing the faith.
That's definitely the intention behind the guidelines, yes. Now, it's worth noting that a baptized non-Catholic Christian can be invited to participate. They can stand as a formal witness to the baptism alongside a qualified Catholic godparent, but they cannot fulfill the official role of the godparent themselves in the eyes of the Church.
Okay, got it. And what are the expected duties or responsibilities of a Catholic godparent today beyond just showing up for the baptism?
Well, at the baptismal ceremony itself, they join in professing the Church's faith on behalf of the child, and they make promises to help raise the child in that faith. Beyond the ceremony, their ongoing duties involve actively supporting the parents in the task of raising the child in the Catholic faith. This includes aiding in their religious education, providing spiritual guidance and support through their own example, helping the child prepare for receiving other sacraments later on, like First Communion and confirmation, and ideally being present for those important milestones in the child's faith journey.
And what about in the child's everyday life, outside of specifically religious events?
The sources, and certainly the cultural expectation in many Catholic communities, suggest the modern godparent is expected to take a genuine active interest in the child's overall life. This often includes acknowledging birthdays and graduations, being available as a trusted confidant or advisor as the child grows older. And while, as we discussed, they aren't automatically legal guardians if something happens to the parents,
Right.
families often do choose godparents with that potential role in the back of their minds, hoping they would be suitable and willing, and then making the corresponding legal provisions separately in their wills. Maintaining regular contact and remembering the godchild in prayer are also strongly encouraged. Culturally, they're often treated very much like close family, sometimes using special terms like Nina or Nino, and having multiple godchildren expands that network of compadres, fellow parents, and godparents bonded through the ritual.
How does the Orthodox Church view godparenthood today? Is it broadly similar to the Catholic approach?
In the Eastern Orthodox Church, godparents, or sponsors as they're often called, are considered equally indispensable to the baptismal rite as they are in the Catholic Church. They play a crucial role.
What's their specific theological significance in Orthodoxy?
In Orthodox theology, the sponsor is seen symbolically as the one who receives the newly illumined soul, the newly baptized person from the waters of the baptismal font. They have a very critical liturgical role during the ceremony itself. They are the ones who stand and verbally renounce evil on behalf of the infant. And then, very significantly, they recite the Nicene Creed, the core statement of Christian faith, professing that faith for the child.
They recite the whole creed for the child. Wow, that really underscores the idea of them acting as the child's representative in faith at that moment.
It's taken extremely seriously. And for this reason, it's a strict requirement that at least one godparent must be an Orthodox Christian themselves, and importantly, be in good standing with the Church. Beyond the ceremony, their post-baptismal duties are quite similar in spirit to the Catholic role. Guiding the child's religious upbringing, sometimes taking responsibility for ensuring they attend church services, and often providing spiritual gifts like icons or prayer books over the years.
And you mentioned a unique custom related to another sacrament.
Yes, in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the sacrament of chrismation, which involves anointing with holy oil and is analogous to confirmation in the West, takes place immediately after baptism as part of the same service. The godparent often physically holds the child or stands supportively with the adult being received during this rite as well, continuing their supportive role in the very moment of receiving the gift of the Holy Spirit.
Okay, let's just quickly clarify one detail that the sources mentioned regarding adult initiation, specifically in the Catholic Church, that RCIA or OCIA process. It sounds like the terms sponsor and godparent are both used, but maybe with a slight distinction in that context.
That's right, yes. The sources note this specific nuance that applies within the Catholic journey for adults joining the Church. For an unbaptized person who is exploring the Catholic faith, an inquirer or a catechumen during the period of formation, the person who walks alongside them, guides them, supports them during those initial stages, is often referred to simply as a sponsor. And sometimes this role can be temporary, or the person might change during the process.
Okay, so a sponsor is more like a guide during the preparation and discernment period.
Exactly. The person then formally takes on the permanent role and title of godparent at a specific liturgical milestone called the rite of election, or sometimes the calling to candidacy for those already baptized. This official godparent then accompanies the catechumen, unbaptized or candidate baptized, through the final intense period of preparation, stands with them as they receive the sacraments of initiation, baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, usually at the Easter Vigil, and then continues to serve as a lifelong mentor and support during the post-baptismal period called mystagogy and beyond.
Okay, that clarifies it. So for an adult convert seeking baptism, sponsor equals guide before formal commitment. Godparent equals guide from formal commitment and initiation onward.
Precisely, that's the key distinction specifically in the adult baptism process. The sources do clarify, though, that for infants being baptized, or for confirmation candidates, or for individuals who were already baptized validly in another Christian tradition and are now seeking full communion with the Catholic Church in those cases, the terms sponsor and godparent are generally used interchangeably for the same permanent supportive role.
And what kind of qualities do the sources say make for a good sponsor or godparent in this demanding adult process? It sounds like a big commitment.
It absolutely is. The sources emphasize that it's intended to be a solemn and essential role, definitely not just an honorific one. Good sponsors or godparents need qualities like, well, availability being present for the person, patience, compassion, obviously a deep and living personal faith themselves, strong listening skills, and maybe the ability to ask good, discerning questions that help the person reflect on their own journey in relationship with God. Parishes are actually strongly encouraged to provide proper training and ongoing support for people who take on this important ministry, recognizing the significance of the role.
It's really striking how much emphasis the formal religious institutions, Catholic, Orthodox, even Lutheran in its own way, still place on the spiritual guidance and mentorship aspect of godparenthood, even while the broader cultural understanding of the role might sometimes drift more towards just familial ties or gift-giving expectations.
It really highlights that enduring core of the role as it was originally intended and is still maintained within those faith traditions.
Okay, so we've focused heavily on Christian godparenthood and its many variations. Are there any similar concepts or analogous roles in non-Christian religions or cultures around the world?
Yeah, that's a great question to broaden the scope. As we kind of touched on briefly earlier, while the Christian godparent institution is definitely unique in its specific history and its theological connection to the sacrament of baptism, the underlying idea of having supportive, non-parent adults who take a special interest in a child's life, their development, their integration into the community, that general concept certainly appears in various forms across different cultures and religions.
Can we revisit the Jewish examples we mentioned, the Sanuk and Coveter?
Sure, yes, those roles within the Brit Milah ceremony, the Sandak who holds the baby, the Kavatar couple who might carry the baby. And they're sometimes loosely translated or compared to godparent roles because they're specific, highly honored positions within that crucial initiation rite. However, as we discussed in classical Judaism, these are roles that are really specific to the ceremony itself. They don't typically involve that kind of ongoing, permanent responsibility for the child's lifelong religious formation or acting as a surrogate spiritual parent in the way that characterizes the Christian godparent model.
Okay. Any other examples from different faith traditions that the sources brought up?
Yes, the sources mention Santeria, which is a religion with roots in West African Yoruba traditions that developed primarily in Cuba. Santeria has a quite well-defined system of godparents, a madrina or yubona for women, a padrino or yubon for men. Importantly, these godparents must themselves be initiated into the faith at a certain level.
And what's their role?
They are expected to provide significant, ongoing spiritual guidance, teaching, and support for their godchild throughout their life within the Santeria religious community. It sounds like a very active and continuous relationship. There's also a practice mentioned called kurvilik, or kirivahi, found in some parts of Turkey and surrounding regions, often associated with the Islamic ritual of circumcision for boys. It creates a specific form of fictive kinship, establishing a really significant, lifelong bond between the child's family and the kurv, the man who holds the child or assists prominently during the circumcision ceremony. The exact nature and permanence of the responsibilities involved can vary culturally, but it's definitely seen as creating a special relationship.
What about Hindu traditions? Is there anything comparable there?
In Hindu traditions, while there isn't a direct one-to-one analog to the Christian godparent, the concept of mentorship and guidance from respected non-parent adults is certainly present, just expressed differently. For example, during the Namkaran, the traditional naming ceremony for a baby, elders or priests play key ritual roles. Sometimes esteemed relatives, like a paternal aunt, bua, or maybe an uncle, might have the honor of choosing the baby's name or whispering it into the baby's ear.
But does that make them a godparent with ongoing duties?
Not typically, no. That specific honor within the naming ceremony doesn't usually come with formal, ongoing responsibilities beyond that ritual moment. Later in a child's life, particularly for boys undergoing rituals like the Upanayana, the sacred thread ceremony marking the beginning of formal education, a guru or teacher takes on a very important mentorship role. But this is more focused on formal, religious, and scriptural instruction, rather than being a family-selected patron figure in the same way. The sources also note that the traditional structure of the Hindu joint family inherently provides children with multiple informal mentors and caregivers in the form of various aunts, uncles, older cousins, and grandparents living together or nearby, fulfilling some of those supportive functions even without a single designated godparent role.
Okay, so it really seems like the underlying function, the need or desire for having supportive adults involved in a child's life, beyond just the immediate parents, is a widely recognized human thing, even if the formal structure, the name, the ritual tie-in, varies enormously across cultures.
That seems to be the common thread, doesn't it? The recognition that raising children well often benefits from a wider network of care, guidance, and support beyond just the nuclear parents.
And finally, we touched on the idea of secular godparents or guide parents earlier, emerging from that Reddit thread. How did that concept develop more broadly? Where did it come from?
Well, the rise of secular states and secular societies, particularly influenced by Enlightenment thinking starting in the 18th century, and alongside a declining or shifting role for established churches in public life in many Western countries. All this created a space, a need perhaps, for alternatives to traditional religious rituals for marking significant life events like birth. This led to the development of specifically secular ceremonies.
Like the civil baptism you mentioned happening during the French Revolution.
Exactly. Practices like civil baptism or secular naming ceremonies emerged during periods like the French Revolution, explicitly as a non-religious way for families to celebrate the birth or arrival of a child. And importantly, these ceremonies often included a provision for designating supportive adult figures who would promise to play a special role in that child's life and upbringing.
So they were consciously mirroring the social function of traditional godparenthood, the public welcoming, the naming, the appointing of special guardians, but deliberately stripping away the religious content and context.
That was clearly the intention, yes. These ceremonies sought to replicate the social function, acknowledging the child publicly, maybe dedicating them to certain civic virtues or Republican ideals instead of religious faith, and identifying non-parent adults who would commit to taking an interest in supporting them. But it was made entirely secular, and you see modern iterations of this today with concepts like non-religious guide parents or secular mentors appointed in humanist naming ceremonies. And this really aligns with that broader historical trend we noted earlier, stemming perhaps from the Enlightenment era onwards, where for many people, the familial and cultural reasons for having godparents reinforcing family ties, honoring close friends, providing extra support began to rival or even outweigh the purely religious motivations.
This has been such an incredible journey tracing this one role through millennia of history, across cultures, faiths, politics, family life. We've covered so much ground.
We really have. We've traced the evolution of godparenthood all the way from its early religious origins as this spiritual guarantor and guide in the nascent church,
Right.
through its massive expansion into a really significant social and, let's face it, sometimes political institution in the medieval and early modern periods.
And then the reevaluation during the Reformation.
Exactly. And finally, its remarkable adaptation and persistence in the modern era, where it continues to serve both enduring religious duties for many, but also fulfills a growing range of secular, familial, and social needs for others.
Through all those transformations, from Roman scepters picking up babies, to Venetian politicians choosing flute players, to Bohemian relatives doubling down on kinship, and modern folks debating gift expectations on Reddit, what do you think is the single enduring core of this role? What's the constant thread?
That's a great question. I think the constant element, the thing that persists across so many of these variations, is maybe the fundamental human desire, or perhaps societal need, for an invested adult figure, someone distinct from the parents, who formally commits to taking a special interest in a child's life. Someone offering support, maybe guidance, just a stable presence, often marked publicly at a key transitional moment like birth or initiation into some kind of community.
And that's why it still matters today, you think? In whatever form it takes, religious godparent, secular godparent, dedicated aunt or uncle.
Precisely. I think godparents, sponsors, guide parents, mentors, whatever label we use, whatever the specific context they serve as potential role models, as confidants, maybe providers of a different kind of stability, connection, and love outside the immediate parent-child dynamic. They represent a tangible commitment from a wider community, whether that's a community of faith, the broader extended family, or a chosen network of close friends to support not just the parents, but the child themselves as they grow and navigate the complexities of the world.
It really does feel like there's almost a universal human impulse to surround our children with this wider web of care and support, doesn't it? To have more people invested in their flourishing beyond just their parents.
It feels like a very powerful, very human way to think about it, yeah.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Given that this role, the godparent, the sponsor, the supportive non-parent adult figure, has persisted and adapted across such vastly different cultures, religions, and historical periods, what fundamental human need or desire do you think this institution, in all its many forms, is really fulfilling?
It really makes you pause and reflect, doesn't it? Maybe it's about that deep-seated need for connection, for intergenerational support, for guidance from trusted figures outside our immediate family. Maybe it's about feeling truly welcomed, claimed, and supported by a community as we begin our journey in life. Lots to ponder there.
Indeed. And that wraps up today's deep dive here on Study Hall. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode where we break down the complex and make it clear. Share the show with a friend who's curious and leave us a review. It really helps others find the podcast. Till next time, stay curious, keep asking questions, and remember, the more you know, the better the world makes sense.